So welcome, all of you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, or well, whatever time zone you're in. For me, it's 1 in the afternoon, but yeah. So let's see. Let's have a look at the questions that we have for today. There we go. Now the first question to come in was from Thomas Bernardes. I will read the question.
Culadasa, actually, I think that you need to press show more comments again because I think Adrian's question was the first one that I see.
Ah, okay. Oh, okay. I thought I was good looking at the bottom of the list, thinking that was the oldest question. Was the first question to come in the oldest question, the one at the top of the list?
Yeah, you can see there's a 6D next to it, which means it's been out there for 6 days. So the other ones are more recent.
Okay, good. I never claimed to be awakened to modern technology. So it makes sense, though. You're adding to the bottom of the list. Okay, so the first question, Adrian. And let me see, Adrian is on the screen. Yep. Oh, there you go. Adrian and Jamie. Is that how you? I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your names correctly. Probably not.
Well, in English it's like that. Adrian and James.
Okay, Adrian and James. Okay. Sounds good.
We are from Spain.
Yes. I'm going to read your question, okay? Unless you wanted to read yourself, but I'll read it. We are 2 meditators from Spain and have been practicing daily for 2 years. One does 1 or 2 sessions, the other 3 or 4 breathing and walking 1-hour meditation. Furthermore, we have listened to several hours of online content and read the first chapter. We have introduced changes in our habits and practicing virtue. Made big progress. Not so much in meditation practice that has been unstable, mainly at stage 2. First of us is stagnant with difficulties to add more sessions, having the free time. The other feels continuous progress, but there's a lot of mind wandering and meditation. Okay, so that's a good background. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's helpful in terms of your questions. So here's the questions. What makes people not achieve stage 10 in 1 year? And how much time does meditators take until stage 4? We regard that stage as critical. Well, I'll agree with that stage is critical in that it really defines the point at which you acquired. It's the point at which you are now actually, you can call yourself a meditator because rather than somebody who's still trying to who's a beginner still trying to meditate. This is the point at which you can keep the meditation object in consciousness, even in the face of and so what makes people not achieve stage 10 in 1 year? There's so many things that are involved in each person is different, of course, with different backgrounds, different conditioning, different problems of all kinds of sorts. And One of the things that can take a lot of time is somebody who's had a lot of psychological trauma, various issues that they need to reconcile and work out. This can increase the time that it takes. But there's a lot of much more straightforward and easy to deal with factors, like how diligent you are, how careful you are following the instructions. And one of the biggest obstacles, not just in the early stages, because it can reappear later on as well, is that of trying too hard and making too much effort. Because this is a very real obstacle. Think of it this way, that trying comes from a place of the very illusion that you're trying to get beyond, which is that that there exists some distinctly real and separate agent who is responsible for making things happen. And this will manifest in a lot of ways, including muscle tension, a higher degree of distractibility, because you're making that force. You're creating an intensity, and meditation needs to be relaxed. Needs to be you need to be diligent. If you're not diligent, it's going to take you longer to succeed. But if instead of just being diligent in terms of following the instructions and not succumbing to any kind of laxity or daydreaming or things like that, but not going too far to the point where you're trying to force something to happen. Your distraction, a gross distraction arises in stage 4, and you try to squish it down rather than just simply redirecting and strengthening your attention to the meditation object. So both lacking diligence and being too effortful can slow a person down. The consistency of your practice, the duration of your practice, these can all be factors. On your personal life situation, these are things that can enter into it. How often is the regularity of your meditation interrupted by some work-related or family-related or other crisis that makes it difficult to maintain? I could just go on and on. There are so many factors that enter into it. Since you're with us, Adrian and James, are there more specifics to this question that maybe I could address more productively if I knew about?
No, it's okay. It's okay. We were just trying to find in what you were saying something that helped us to achieve stage 4 more easily than we are actually finding it.
Okay, so what you're actually asking is for some tips and advice on how to progress more rapidly than you have been able to so far. Is that put it on the other side? It's not what could keep you from progressing, but what can you do to progress more rapidly? And that's why it makes sense that you described your current situation. So the regularity of practice seems to be there for both of you, and you're doing walking meditation as well. Sounds like you're doing a lot of the right things. So I would come back to, you're having trouble reaching stage 4. The first thing that I ask, and hopefully it's a simple answer, is are you really clear on the difference between attention and peripheral awareness, and are you able to use introspective awareness to recognize to recognize the presence of gross distractions before they cause forgetting or mind wandering?
Well, the short answer is no. I mean, we intellectually can describe what is the difference between attention and peripheral awareness. We have heard about many analogies, the analogy of the light and the vision analogy. But
I'd say
but
that.
we,
Go ahead.
sorry, please.
Okay. Well, I think that may be really the root of the problem, because knowing the difference intellectually isn't what's important. It's being able to distinguish the two so that you can use them, so that you can use introspective awareness to achieve the goals, especially of the third and the fourth path. What the third and fourth stage. The second stage, you're mostly relying on, the mind's natural reward system. So you're rewarding yourself for the kind of mental events that are conducive to shortening mind wandering and increasing the periods of stable attention when you have the opportunity to start exercising introspective awareness. But most of what stage 2 is about is really starting to recognize more and more what is going on in your mind in those periods when the mind is not wandering. It's the beginning of the process. But in stage 1, there's that 4-step transition to the meditation object. If you're not experientially clear on the difference between attention and awareness, what the first 3 of those 4 steps is really all about is playing with attention and noticing the difference, learning to recognize the difference between awareness, peripheral awareness, and attention, beginning to work with it extrospectively. So extrospective attention, or extrospective awareness rather, of distractions and no, what am I talking about? Extrospective awareness of whatever is going on, of everything that's going on in the 4-step transition. You want to develop really strong awareness is primarily extrospective. In stage 2, now you're beginning to want to develop introspective awareness. In stage 3, you want that to be really strong. But if you don't know experientially what it is, if it's not clear to you yet what it is, then you're going to have more trouble doing that. I mean, you can do it. You can learn to distinguish between the two, but that 4-step transition really is an opportunity to play around with the two. And then once you have that ability, then you can do things like focus in more closely on the meditation object and see how your peripheral awareness collapses, or open up your peripheral awareness and see how that the clarity of perception of the meditation object in attention diminishes, and just move back and forth in that balance. Now you're actually using introspective awareness and attention. So you've not only come to where you can recognize and distinguish between the two. Now, this is going to continue through second, third, fourth stages of development, and where you're moving in the direction of being able to use introspective awareness to recognize the events that are going to lead to, in stage 4, gross distraction, in stage 3, forgetting, and In stage two, you're basically just recognizing, you're just practicing recognizing awareness when it's present while you're focusing your attention on the meditation object. So if you can get really clear on the distinction between attention and awareness, I think your progress, you're going to be able to use them in a way that you greatly speed up your progress. Probably the time that you put in now, you're going to get a payoff from that, because now you're going to be bringing in the missing ingredient, and so all the work you've done up to now, you're going to get the payoff for.
You mean that we should be able to recognize we are using both of those faculties individually? I mean, for example, now I am using attention, and now I'm using awareness.
No, it's just opposite of that.
I kind of.
It's knowing, recognizing that
you can just use attention.
Well, you can, but you don't. The only reason for just using attention would be to say, it's just like I thought it was. There's really no reason. What you want to do is to recognize that both are present simultaneously. I'm paying attention to my breath. I'm paying attention to the sensations of the beginning and the ending of the in-breath, for example. But at the same time, I'm peripherally aware of thoughts coming and going in the background. I'm peripherally aware of sensations in my body and sounds in my environment and so forth. What you're after is recognizing when they're both there, that they're always both there simultaneously. Unless, your peripheral awareness may be collapsed down to nothing, in which case what you really experience is primarily attention. But you don't really want that. You want to be able to see, you want to be able to recognize that they're both present at the same time. You see, this creates a scenario where, I'm following my breath. But in my peripheral awareness, I see that there is a thought, and I see that my attention keeps alternating back and forth with that thought, and it takes away from the stability of attention on the breath. So when you can see those two things happening simultaneously, yes, I'm following the breath, but my attention is also alternating with this distraction in the background. I used an example of a thought. Maybe it's a noise. Maybe it's a dog barking outside. Usually that will trigger a thought about the dog barking outside, but it may be just preceded by a feeling of annoyance. These are two things that are going on simultaneously. Your attention may go to something in peripheral awareness, and you recognize, my attention has moved to the sound of the barking dog, or my attention has moved to this thought. And then that allows you to focus your attention more closely on the meditation object, so that it no longer is alternating as much with what's in the background. Now, once you recognize the difference between the background, that's awareness, and what you're focusing on, that's attention, when you're not at this point trying to get rid of everything in the background. You want it to be there. You just don't want it to start receiving enough attention that it's going to destabilize the attention on the meditation object. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. We understand, and we actually have noticed that before, because obviously those two concepts are in the whole book, and in almost every audio that we have heard about, and we obviously realize that if we don't understand or we cannot recognize them clearly, we won't be able to follow the instructions properly.
Yes, and there you've got the essence.
But we kind of guess that we would need some certain stability of mind to be able to recognize them clearly.
Yes.
Or a normal person who may just start meditating who would be able to recognize the difference between the two.
And You see, the two are present for everyone all the time, but there's no recognition of it. You look at most people that talk about the mind, you look at most people that talk about consciousness, they use awareness and attention interchangeably. You look at most meditation teachers and most meditation manuals, and you go back to the early Buddhists themselves, they didn't recognize the difference between them. When you can recognize them as two distinct things that are happening simultaneously, it allows you to use them. And that's what speeds up the process of meditation enormously in this system compared to meditation systems that don't acknowledge, that don't recognize the distinction and don't teach you how to use those two faculties to reinforce each other and support each other. So this is what's at the essence of it, is developing that ability to, first you have to recognize, and then to use these two faculties interactively. And that's what leads to rapid progress. And so that's, if you're struggling towards stage 4 and have been for a long time, then that's where I would put my focus, and getting to the place where you can not only recognize but use these two faculties independently or interactively, either one, whichever is most important to the practice that you're doing. That's going to carry right through to the end. You're right. So I hope that's helpful. I hope that.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. If you want to skip the rest of our questions, because we took too much time and there's a lot of other questions, there's no problem, and we can just ask them again in the next Q&A.
That's good. I appreciate that, and I think I've given you something to work with, which will help a lot there. So.
Okay. Thank you.
So should we just take these in order? Or might as well. Nathan Becker. Completely overcoming the fetters of sense desire and ill will is a tall order for a layperson in a society which bombards us with sense pleasures and divides us with adversarial state of politics and media. Boy, you can sure say that again. That is really true. On the other hand, to even be able to begin the process of overcoming the fetters of sense desire and ill will in that environment, it's an enormous achievement. There's a geshe that I spent some time with, and we talked a lot about what it's like, what the path is like for an ordained person versus a lay person. And he and I both agreed to a statement that he made, is that the path of the ordained practitioner is easier, but at the same time not as powerful as the practice of as a layperson. And there is the example of the bhikkhu who went off into seclusion, spent a lot of time practicing, felt that he had achieved awakening and had overcome desire and aversion. So he returned back he was on his way back to rejoin his Sangha, and as now what he thought of what he had accomplished in his solitude. The first crossroads that he came to, back in those days, every crossroads was a marketplace. And the first crossroads that he came to, and the noise and the squabbling of the people and the road being covered with animal dung that he had to walk through and all this other stuff. And he lost it, and he realized that, wow, it's easy to entertain these particular states that he had achieved in isolation, but for it to become not a state, but to become to represent a permanent shift in perception and response to situations, you actually need the resistance, you need the pressure, you need the problems that are presented. Now, had he stayed in the monastery, that would have been provided by his association with his fellow bhikkhus. So think of it this way: as a layperson, the challenge is greater than if you were in a monastery and all you had to deal with was the other monks who had a lot of the same goals and indoctrination and so forth that you do. To do so as a layperson, the challenge is bigger. But it can be overcome. It's not insurmountable challenge. And when you've overcome it, you have truly overcome it to a much, much deeper and more stable degree than somebody who has had less challenge to do so. What are some strategies, techniques, both on the cushion and off, that you've discovered are particularly effective for weakening and ultimately eradicating these fetters? What is referred to as the practice of virtue, and in the appendix of the book, there is the practice of mindful review, which is intended to help bring you to the place of being able to practice virtue and have strong mindfulness and practice virtue in daily life. So this gives you these really powerful opportunities off the cushion to directly confront the fetters of self-desire, sense desire, and ill will. Every single time your desire inclines you to do something which is unwholesome, because it's it's speech that's going to be injurious to somebody else, or that you're going to in some way enhance or increase the advantage to you in a particular situation at the cost of somebody else. If you recognize that mindfully and you deny that desire, that impulse, then that weakens that desire. And it also weakens the attachment to self that gives rise to that. So that's a powerful strategy off the cushion. Now, we take this on the cushion, okay? And you have desires and aversions that arise that are on the cushion. And a lot of the instruction is all about how to respond to those times when a desire to think about something else or do something else rather than actually practice, or to find some easier way to do the practice than what you've been instructed in. So those are the kind of desires that arise on the cushion, and it has the same effect every time you recognize that desire for what it is and let go of it, allow it to be there if it needs to be, but continue to be diligent in practicing according to the instruction, then the less likely that desire is going to arise and create a problem in the future. I could go through a similar process discussing aversion. Sometimes there's aversion for sitting for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it's due to physical pain or whatever. But it's the same thing. It's how you respond to the aversion when it arises. And can you see you're really doing both the same things on and off the cushion? You do this on the cushion without even attempting to be more mindful in your daily life. You're going to end up being more mindful in your daily life just because eventually this is going to begin to overflow into your daily life. So the essence of the strategy or the technique is recognize these desires, these fetters, when they arise, and do your best to not let them control your feelings, your thoughts, and your actions in daily life, speech and actions, and meditation, your mental actions that you take place. That's ultimately the most effective strategy. Now, let me just add to that. In the beginning, you're not going to be successful that often. You're going to succumb. That's all right. What you do then is you become mindful of the consequences of having succumbed. So on the cushion, some thought comes up. It's very inviting. You succumb to the temptation to pursue that thought, and you pursue that thought for a period of time. Then you come back to your meditation, and that you realize that what you've done by indulging in that is it's going to be that much longer before you're able to further advance in your practice, that you have conditioned yourself to make it easier to succumb to similar interesting ideas in the future. That may be your experience of it. The next time you sit down and you find that an interesting thought comes up, and once again you're tempted to pursue that rather than continue the practice, which is not as enjoyable as pursuing that thought. So hopefully that points the way to how to work with these things.
It does. I was, of course, hoping for a magic formula because this is really hard. But I think you're exactly right. It's yes, I got them.
Okay, great. It's yes. We do want magic. We do, and a lot of us come to the Dharma in venues and traditions that promise us a lot of magic, but really there isn't. Everything is cause and effect, and then there's some causes that you can implement that are more effective more quickly, but there's no way out of the fact that it's cause and effect. And no magic. You're going to have to go through the process.
Yeah, you're right. I seem to recall. I think it was a YouTube video of yours where you talked about determinism and free will, and in a given moment of time, if you're mindful, things aren't deterministic. You have, because of all of your past karma, you now have a set of possibilities to choose from if you're mindful. And it sounds like you use past karma, and so only in that moment of mindfulness can you kind of intentionally select the karma that will influence your future possibilities. So that sounds like essentially what you're talking about. You can slowly shape a more virtuous karma, which means less craving in the future, less impulsivity.
Right, exactly.
Right? Okay.
And recognizing that, and be in the forgiving place of recognizing that sometimes your conditioning is going to be too strong to overcome that.
I am intimately familiar with that now.
Right, but that's not something to get mad at yourself about. That's something to say, aha, that's where I am with this thing. So,
So yeah, thank you. That's awesome advice. Appreciate it.
Right, yeah, you're welcome. You go on, do you think some particularly distracting modern technology should be minimized or avoided in order to cultivate a mind more capable of achieving samatha, equanimity, and insight? On the one hand, I have to admit that in recent years, I resisted for a very long time, but in the last couple of years, I've joined the cult of the cell phone, where I have my cell phone in my pocket here, and it is to the degree that you can minimize the use of smartphones and this kinds of technology, the easier it will be, because you formulated a certain kind of habit. Why do you grab your cell phone, or why do you check your email? You're looking for that little dopamine hit that comes when there's something interesting there, right? And what you're doing is you're just reinforcing the habituation that is already there to pursue that which is potentially pleasurable or potentially pleasurable at the expense of something that is ultimately more beneficial to you. So it's not easy to do, though. Like I say, I spend a lot of time on a computer, and I carry a laptop. And the last 2 years, I carry a smartphone with me all the time. So hard thing to avoid in our society. One of the things that's worth thinking about for all of us on this path, and especially anyone who is interested in teaching and helping others, is really to see how do we adapt, how can we adapt these habits rather than just deny them. This technology has become so central to functioning in the world. I mean, it would be a form of withdrawal from the world to say I'm only going to check my cell phone twice a day at this time and that time, and likewise with my email and so forth. But I think what's ultimately more productive is to recognize that these technologies are going to become more and more predominant. And how do we find a way to approach the use of these technologies that is actually conducive to more success in our practice and in developing insight and achieving awakening? And I don't know the answer to that yet, but we can all work on it together since we're all in the same cultural milieu.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I'm reading a book right now called The Distracted Mind. It's a very good book by Adam Gazzaley and Larry Rosen. It talks about how, in the dopamine reward system, there's natural rewards. Everyone's kind of aware of food and sex being things you kind of have to look out for as far as addiction and natural drive goes. But these researchers have discovered that information and sociality are also natural rewards in humans. And so that's, why the phone is so addicting, and that dopamine hit you get from checking your email or social media, for instance, is a double ping in the natural reward system of information and sociality. So it's kind of like, I feel as though like having that in my pocket all the time is like always having a bag of McDonald's in my hand, and it's like, it's just really difficult to not eat it, or to not check your phone. So that's kind of what prompted the whole, like, well, if I just don't have a bag of McDonald's in my hand all the time, I won't eat it. And then parallel to that, well, if I don't have my phone in my pocket all the time, maybe I won't be driven to check it.
And to the degree that you can minimize doing that, it will be to your immediate and direct advantage. But I see it as being a bigger problem of learning how to incorporate this into practice, and I don't know that we'll find the answer to that very soon, but we have to.
Cool. Well, thank you. That totally satisfied me. I think you answered my question pretty thoroughly. Both my questions.
Actually, I'll add another little aspect to that I've discovered in myself, is that you can become addicted to every time something pops into your mind that you'd like to know something about, you Google it.
Yes, yeah, you know what? I had that thought and just talked to my friend the other day about it, and I would say that is my addiction. If I had to pick one thing.
And so you look at it, and well, there's many ways in which it's positive because you're constantly learning. But in terms of awakening, it's getting in the way.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I'll just add really quickly that there was a study done on that Googling everything phenomenon, and it was found that you're essentially outsourcing your own working memory. So you intuitively come to know that you no longer need to remember anything because you have a tool that that is an eternal, infinite library, that is Google. So I think that's a pretty fascinating effect that Google has on the memory recall.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that one too, because yes, that's another one that I've noticed. And as you get older, and I'm older, and your memory isn't quite as good as it used to be, the temptation to rely entirely on your devices, your electronic devices, to do that for you is great. So.
I'll just confirm that happens when you're young too.
Yes, I know that it does, but so Evgeny, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly.
Yevgeny, but Yevgeny is absolutely fine as well.
Evgeny, okay. So TMI says that long months or years retreats are not critical to achieving insight. Since regular diligent practice, 1 to 2 hours a day is sufficient for progress. At the same time, Ajahn Chah said that solitude is essential for a meditator's progress, especially for novices. Likewise, Anapanasati Sutta begins the explanation about a monk that goes into the wilderness to be alone. And yes, those statements really define the operating paradigm for about 2,500 years of Buddhism. It was in every Buddhist culture, I can't think of any exception at all. Basically, the attitude was that if you were a layperson, the best that you could hope for would be to accumulate enough merit through support of the monastic system and other good acts, so that you could come back in a position to become a monastic, actually also to become a male monastic, so that you could become awakened. So they are echoing the 2,500-year-old tradition that says that lay people don't get enlightened. If you go back to the time of the Buddha, though, and there's extensive lists of awakened of lay people that are awakened to greater or lesser degrees, and who are identified as tremendous teachers of the Dhamma, etc., and so on. So, and the other thing that you find in the suttas themselves is a lot of people who are becoming awakened, who haven't become, who haven't entered into prolonged periods of retreat to do so. So the whole point of this is that in spite of what Buddhism institutionally has come to say, the original teachings of the Buddha granted that lay people become awakened, and also that women become awakened, because they're amongst the Teris, the elders of the time, elder women in the time of the Buddha. There are many of them who are identified as arhats. So you have to distinguish between the tradition that has grown up since the time of the Buddha, what the Buddha actually talks about happening, and what we in this modern era are recognizing is what has to happen. Lay people not only can, according to the Buddha, become awakened, but in the world that we're living in now, large numbers of people have to become awakened. Otherwise, we're probably going to have a total cultural collapse and perhaps the extinction of our species. So you go on to say that, Jeannie, you say, my line of work, chief executive officer, is generally known for being stressful. I sometimes worry that it would be hard for me to get beyond the current stage 4 unless I find a way to spend a few weeks or months in solitude. Could you please comment on how important solitude is to the progress in early stages? Well, it definitely acts as an accelerant. And in a situation like yours, where you have a very stressful life, then the opportunities either to reduce the stress in your life or to take some time away to do intensive practice become much more important. And I by no means intended to say don't bother doing retreats. To the contrary, I'd say do retreats, do as many retreats, short or long, as you have the opportunity to do. But don't fall into the trap of feeling like, well, because I can't go on 3 months of retreat every year, I'm never going to be awakened. I'm never going to achieve stage 10 shamatha and things like that. That isn't true. But your situation may be such that it's going to be extremely advantageous for you to create the time and the opportunity to go on a retreat. If you find that the degree of stress that you're experiencing is keeping you stuck at stage 4, then a retreat might be just the thing it takes. You know, you'll go into retreat and you'll come out at stage 6 or 7, and you'll be able to deal with the stress in your life so much more effectively. And that's the place that retreats take. Now, some fortunate person who can do numerous retreats of various length, and they're obviously going to benefit from that. You know, they're obviously going to progress much more quickly. So we're not denying that. But my whole point here is, if you're very limited in the amount of retreat time that you can engage in, and especially if you end up in a conversation with somebody who says, well, you know, you have to do a 3-year retreat, 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days in order to become awakened, you can safely and confidently say, I don't believe that's been true. That's true. I've been taught otherwise. And then you can demonstrate the truth of that.
Thank you so much for the answer. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So, just to add to that, I had somebody just left yesterday, and he's running a business, and it turned out throughout his retreat, he's been here on retreat twice, and this last time I think was for 10 days. Throughout his retreat, he's had to, he operates a business, he's had to have business meetings every morning with his employees. And in spite of that, he's made very rapid progress. He's also made really significant progress in the time between these 2 retreats, when he was even more fully engaged in his role as the owner and executive officer of a business. So, I mean, he's not necessarily the same person that any one of you are, but what he does is represent. He's a representative of the fact that some people have achieved very rapid progress in spite of not even being able to go fully in retreat when they do go in retreat.
Thank you.
So next we have Michael.
Culadasa, I think you skipped over Shannon's question.
Oh, I did. Oh, you're right. I did. I'm sorry. I didn't see that. As practice progresses and suffering declines, questions begin naturally to arise as to what practice and Dharma might mean beyond insight into anatta and emptiness of phenomena, beyond the end of suffering. There is so much beyond that. There are 2 suttas, one where the Buddha compares the dirt under his fingernails with the earth. Another, he compares a handful of leaves with all the leaves in the forest. He says, what I'm teaching you is as the dirt under my fingernails compared to the earth. And so, there is so much more to this Dharma than just overcoming the inherent sense of self and recognizing the emptiness of phenomena. Those actually are doorways They involve a shift in perception. You live in a different place from a totally different perspective as a result of these insights that bring about awakening. And the effect of that is to open you up to much, much vaster possibilities than you could have imagined from the point of view of a worldling. But I'll say something too about that, is that the further you go, the more that you realize that the ultimate wisdom is knowing that you don't know, and you find yourself becoming more and more fully engaged with what is a mystery that you're never going to be able to penetrate, but you're only going to be able to dwell in harmony with at an intuitive level. But at any kind of at this point, the limitations of the rational mind and logical thought and everything like that have been reached. So yeah, there's so much that lies beyond as these insights deepen, and as your understanding of what is really going on, as that increases, you become in contact with a very awesome mystery. Now, the other thing that happens is that, particularly with anatta, the recognition that the self that you've been attached to is empty, and especially with the achievement of the fourth path, the arhat, and the falling away of this inherent sense of being a separate self. This, combined with a really deep realization that everything, without exception, is not only causally interconnected, but interpenetrating, then what you do is you no longer are living from the place of an individual self, but as a process that is part of a much greater process, and the dominant motivator of your action becomes compassion, the desire, the recognition of the suffering of all of these beings who are no longer separate from you. And so you respond to that in the same way that you once responded to the suffering of the personal self that you were attached to. You naturally are inclined to manifest that compassion, and this is where the Mahayana, the great Mahayana breakthrough, was the recognition that because we are not separate selves, and because of the interpenetrating interconnectedness of everything, the only way that this I that engages in the practice to become awakened can become fully awakened is when every sentient being in the universe becomes fully awakened, because I am not separate from any other sentient being. You see that? But anatta, emptiness, paticca samuppada, impermanence, understanding the nature of suffering, all of these, that's the wiping away of the delusion. It's experiencing things much more as they are. And it's opening into something much greater. It's a beginning, not an ending. Is Shannon with us? I don't see Shannon, so she
Nope.
can't respond to that. Anybody else who would like to respond to that, feel free. Yeah, the more I know I don't know. My visual metaphor for that is you imagine a vast expanse. And within that is this circle. And the vast expanse is ultimate truth. And the little tiny circle is what I know. And the circumference of the circle is what I know that I don't know. Got it? So as the circle gets bigger, the circumference expands. The more I know, the greater the circumference. In other words, the more I know that I don't know. And ultimate reality in this metaphor is infinite in expanse. So as I keep knowing more and more, as my knowledge expands, the more I know I don't know. And we find ourselves, and this is, you find much of this in the mystical descriptions of different traditions, that what you discover is not that you are the omniscient holder of all possible knowledge, but that you find yourself immersed in a mystery that is so much greater than yourself, that you can only surrender to it. So I guess now we're at Mike's question. Let me check if Mike is here. Is Mike here? I'm wondering, what do you think, Ted? Would it be better to answer questions for the people that are here or not?
Well, I mean, a lot of people can't make it, so in a sense, it's a little unfair.
A little unfair. Okay, I agree. Yeah. All right. Well, what Mike asked, well, this is a question that comes up a lot recently. I'd really appreciate an explanation of how somebody can be an adept meditator and also engage in physically and sexually abusive behavior. If this practice does, in fact, incline one towards compassion for all beings, how can it be that there have been multiple cases of respected and advanced practitioners who have acted in this way? My practice has been incredibly valuable to me over the last few years, but I find that this is one issue which sometimes undermines my faith in the Dharma, as it seems to imply the changes are not as profound as many would suggest. Well, let me deal with the last part of that first. A lot of the hype around the Dharma and the awakening and a Buddha, what a Buddha is, the elevation of Buddha to the stature of gods with their own Buddha worlds and things like that. The idea that that all these magical things are going to happen when you become awakened, that's not realistic. That is really, that's magical thinking. But we have something here. What's come up recently? There's a few people who are in their studies. Mike's question is framed in terms of an adept meditator, but these studies are framed in terms of people who claim to be awakened, or who are purported to be awakened, or who are generally recognized within the tradition that they teach or otherwise, that they enjoy some degree of awakening. Okay, and one of the things that's emerged, and Richard Doyle in his book on awakened consciousness, realizing awakened consciousness, he specifically mentions this. It comes up with Jeff Martin and Jeffrey's exploration of all the, not only the original cohort of supposedly awakened people that he dealt with, but in all the people that have gone through his Finder's course. He also alludes to the fact that although we like to join, we like to speak of wisdom and compassion as being conjoined, that they are not as tightly joined, they're not as tightly coupled as we may assume. And that a person can achieve great wisdom without really developing compassion. There's a certain baseline of true compassion that develops when somebody awakens to the fact that they are not a separate self and that everything is interpenetrating. Then this gives rise to true compassion, as opposed to the compassion of a worldly being whose compassion is limited by his self-attachment, his or her self-attachment. But this compassion that arises, let's say at stream entry with this realization, it's kind of a baseline. It needs to be developed. And I'd say that the Tibetan tradition, more so than any other tradition I know of, actually goes to great lengths to develop this, to develop compassion itself, practices of Lojong and so forth. So compassion doesn't always go with wisdom, and somebody can achieve rather exalted states of spiritual wisdom, but still have a rather primitively developed compassion, and that can allow them to rationalize their behaviors. You know, you're probably, most of you, familiar with a Zen teacher who actually rationalized his sexual exploitation of female students as being acts of compassion by which he was helping them to break through various psychological barriers that were holding back, that was holding them back. Now, we can look at this and we can say, well, this is obviously not compassionate behavior. Look at the damage it's done to the not only the women that he engaged with in this way, but their partners and so on and so forth. If you're familiar with the story of this, and this is not, I'm using the example of one particular Zen teacher, but this is true of there are multiple instances of this. And the common theme you find, well, Chogyam Trungpa did this. He did things that were actually harmful to a lot of people and rationalized them as actually being forms of teaching and therefore acts of compassion in an attempt to help them overcome their defilements. And so now we can see how if wisdom is developed, but compassion is not, we can end up with a very wise person who ends up rationalizing behaviors that are not, they're completely at odds with true compassion. Now, there is a further problem with this. I say the Tibetans, more than any other tradition I know, have focused on the development of compassion, but they've done it in an odd way. They, you know, if you're familiar with Mathieu Ricard, and they did fMRI studies of him as he was doing compassion meditation, and they found that parts of the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the cortex that were associated with pleasure and happiness really were really strongly activated when he did compassion meditation. Now, this is something, it's a fact about compassion, that it does engender pleasure and even blissful state. But if you look at the history of Tibet, of comfortable monks living in lavish monasteries, surrounded by struggling peasants who were actually supporting these wealthy monasteries, you realize that the compassion that they're practicing isn't really compassion. It would only be compassion if they acted on the suffering that they saw. And so that not only can there be a dissociation between wisdom and true compassion, but if we define, which I do, compassion as the compulsion to relieve the suffering of others, if possible, and having the wisdom and equanimity to distinguish when it's not possible. If we define compassion in that way, then within the Tibetan system, and this is the karma that the karma of Tibet that the Buddha referred to as explaining why China invaded. You know, he said it was the karma of Tibet to have that happen. This is what he's referring to, that somehow or another, in over the course of Tibetan Buddhist history, they managed to make a further dissociation between the positive affective experience that compassion gives rise to, and the actual act of, or the actual acting out of compassion to make change. So please don't be disillusioned by the Dharma as a whole, because over its history, certain traditions have introduced certain distortions, and that these manifest. There's other things I could say about this as well. We create unrealistic beliefs about what it means even to be a stream entrant, and even more unrealistic expectations for arhat. And as I've already told you, arhat is not the end of the path. In a sense, it's almost the beginning. It's the beginning of a much greater path that goes much further than that. But don't lose faith in the value of this path, but be on the lookout in yourself and in the sources of your teaching for these distortions that have developed, so that you can avoid them, so that you can cultivate true compassion, which the best way of describing how one manifests true compassion is in that serenity prayer, which is to, how is it worded, to fix the things that you can fix and accept the things that you can't fix, and to have the wisdom to know the difference. Now that's the expression of true compassion in a person's life. And someone who has that is not going to be engaging in behaviors that are abusive to others or exploitive of others. And Matthias Lindstrom mentions that Shinzen addresses I have to go to that to see what Shinzen happened to say with Dan Harris on that point. That's what I have to say about it, Mike. Kevin, can you talk about the importance and benefits of super slow walking meditation? I think many of us, myself included, neglect it in favor of more casual, mindful walking, and perhaps out of aversion to the tedium or lack of privacy space. How critical is it for our daily practice? All of the walking meditations are very powerful. The different forms of it accentuate certain benefits. And there are definitely benefits specifically to super slow walking. That doesn't mean that super slow walking, or for that matter, any other of the myriad of different techniques that are offered in different traditions, is absolutely essential. None are. There are a variety of ways to achieve the same thing. But to get into that degree of focused and aware of focused attention and expansive awareness that develops and becomes characteristic of super slow walking carries over in a very wonderful way to your sitting. And I know that many people tend to, I've seen this so many times at retreats throughout my life, not just retreats I've led, but retreats I've attended, that probably the majority of meditators regard the walking meditation periods in a retreat as a break. And it's not. It is a formal practice with as much benefit, as much power, and is very complementary to sitting meditation. So walking meditation in itself is a very, very powerful method that should never be neglected, but many people do. Now, Kevin, you're saying that you neglect the super slow walking, but you still do the more casual, mindful walking. I would say, please try the other more intensive forms of walking meditation. I'm really glad that you do actually do mindful walking rather than just take your walking meditation as a way to take a break between sits. But please do try the others. Give them a good try. See if you can discover the particular benefits that they will provide for you. And if you find a particular method or technique of walking, you give it a good try and it doesn't seem to do anything for you, well, then that's fine. There's a lot of other ways to get to the same place. Okay? Maybe a couple of general statements about walking. You can think of walking as a bridge between the powerful mindfulness of sitting meditation and the powerful mindfulness that you wish you had when you were engaging in your daily life. Walking meditation it can be a bridge between those two things. The second general thing I would say about walking meditation is there's a certain complementarity between it and sitting. In sitting meditation, it's easier to develop focused attention on the breath. It's an additional effort to maintain a powerful awareness, especially an introspective or metacognitive introspective awareness at the same time. It's easier to sink into some kind of unaware but single pointed concentration, and it has its own pleasant qualities to it, but it's not productive of insight and awakening. So sitting meditation, concentration is easier, but developing peripheral awareness is more of a challenge. Walking meditation is exactly the opposite. When you're out there and you're actually walking, awareness becomes very, very naturally to you. It tends predominantly in the beginning to be extrospective awareness, but as you're combining it with sitting meditation, after a while it becomes a lot of introspective awareness. You're watching how your mind reacts to a sound or something that you see or something that you experience in the process of walking. In walking meditation, it's easy to maintain peripheral awareness. It is correspondingly more difficult to keep the attention focused on the sensations of walking. This makes the two of them very complementary to each other. The strength of one compensates for the weakness of the other. And so combining the two is a really good way to increase the rapidness of your progression in your meditation practice. The last general thing I'll say about walking is you'll find that I'm constantly reminding you to look for the joy bring as much positive reinforcement into your meditation practice as you can. Walking outside, especially in an appropriately conducive environment, can produce an enormous amount of joy, which you can then carry into the meditation hall and to the cushion, and greatly enhance the quality of your sitting meditation afterwards. So these are the immediate benefits of walking meditation, why it shouldn't be neglected. Anyone who needs to go because we've gone more than an hour, just please feel free to, but I don't mind continuing. We have more questions that I'm probably going to be able to get to today.
Maybe we should ask Thomas to pick one of the 5, assuming that that's the Thomas who's on the call.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea.
Michael Walsh.
Oh, do you mean Michael Walsh?
Yeah, sorry, Michael Walsh.
Yeah, can you do that, Michael?
He's not here.
Yeah, he was on the call, but I think he dropped off.
Well, he dropped off. Okay, so that doesn't work. Okay. Well, let's see. Let's see what we might find most interesting. Question 1. Could you talk more about how analytical meditation can be used in the development of PT? There's a footnote in TMI that says analytical meditation can be used to cultivate PT, but little information is given. Could you discuss this, how it happens, and maybe recommend particular topics for it?
Looks like Chuladasa's link is frozen.
Just having a cessation right now.
Nice. He's calling from Kochi's Stronghold, which is about 20 miles down a dirt road in the middle of the desert. And he has 1.5 megabit per second DSL there, which is kind of amazing, but it doesn't always work. There he is.
Okay. I'm back again. I was just trying to call in by phone, and but fortunately, hopefully I won't be dropped again. What was the last thing that I was saying when you stopped being able to hear me?
You were just reading the first question, and I think you'd gotten pretty much to the end of it, or halfway through, maybe.
Oh, okay, good. Let me just get back to that question. No, that's not really okay. Yeah, I found that analytical meditation has really helped in my understanding of the Dharma in my intellectual and creative life. I find many people ignore it, but I think it has many benefits. So I would certainly agree with that, and that is a really important part of the value of analytical meditation. Michael is asking specifically how it can help with the development of PT. So analytical meditation can help in the development of PT by helping you to resolve any sort of, you see, PT is directly related to the unification of the mind. What impedes the unification of the mind, one of the things that impedes unification of the mind, is internal conflicts of various kinds, including the entire gamut of things that get purified in stage 4 and then at a deeper level or more subtle level in stage 7. And analytical meditation can, outside being used separate from the actual practice of shamatha, things that come up that you can reflect upon them analytically in a way, especially if you can reflect upon them in the context and the light of the Dharma, can make it easier to resolve these particular impediments to unification of the mind. It can facilitate the process of purification. This has to be done very, very carefully, though, because if you follow the method of analytical meditation the way it's described, you can avoid. It's easier to avoid the pitfall. Now, the pitfall is that something has arisen in your mind in meditation. You haven't reached a resolution with it. You do an analytical meditation, and then rather than allowing things to arise from the unconscious mind, that you let the one part of your mind that represented by attention get into its reductionistic and analytical mode. And it's often going to come up with explanations that are not, they're not valid and can be misleading. The other thing is that some of these can be of the nature that are hiding what the real issue is, requiring a purification. But yes, it does. It has many benefits, and the way to use it is when something comes up in meditation that you feel like could deserve to be investigated from a more analytical perspective, do so. But also don't just think about it in the normal way. Do enter into that creative mode of problem solving that allows all of the parallel processors of your unconscious mind to contribute to finding answers to questions or clarifying that which isn't clear. The next question really seems very specific to Michael, although Taylor says he'd be interested to hear how I explain it. And he mentions the correlation I draw between jhanas 1 to 4 and stages 7 to 10. In the interests of time, why don't we leave it at that? In a sense, I feel like Taylor has provided enough of an answer to that question for the time being, and somebody wants to go into more detail, we can do that on another occasion. Question 4, do you have any recommended sources for practicing the jhanas, the formless jhanas, and the powers, as TMI does not give much information of them, except to say it is beyond the scope of this book? The powers referred to are related to the fourth formless jhana, not our fourth form jhana, not the formless jhana. And the only one of those that I have ever intentionally and actively pursued is past lives. As far as recommended sources for practicing the formless jhanas, I haven't looked that much into what other people have written about the jhanas, so I couldn't, off the top of my head, give you an answer to that question. And we're still with Michael here. His fifth question, what practices or techniques would one do to remember past lives? We've talked about having experiences that are like past life memories. Ignoring the issues of whether these are actually past lives as there is no self, how would one with strong concentration actually remember past lives? What is the technique and where could one read more about this type of practice? Well, there are basically two techniques that I use. One, which is, as I say, based in fourth jhana. And in that fourth jhana, there is an opening to what I describe as vast amounts of information from that would otherwise be entirely unconscious. The second thing is that in that jhana, much as in the dream state, as sometimes occurs in the dream state, that I preface this by saying that I find that all of our minds are actually connected, but the individual mind is not a thing, but rather an artificial barrier that separates our mind from everybody else's mind. And that's important because that way when you walk out the door in the morning, you know which office to go to work, or which workplace to go to. So, but from the fourth jhana, there are practices. Actually, the one place that I think this may be described a little bit is in Shinzen Jiang, The Science of Meditation. You know, the Sounds True set of CDs that he produced a number of years ago. I think he addresses this a little bit in talking about fourth jhana, if I remember correctly. But it's not a method that I can describe in this. In this context very, very simply and readily. But that is one method that I use. The other is a method of regression, that you go back in your memories in your own life to the point of the recollection of your birth, and then at that point you can go beyond that and begin to experience recollections of other lives. And that is a technique that is it's not a specifically Buddhist technique, and it's one that I remember learning about from a book that I got, and I can't remember the name of the book at all. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. But regression is an effective path to bringing up these kinds of memories. Now, I just finished by saying that having done this, having done these past life or other life practices, I initially did this because of, I was running into strong opposition to those people who very, very firmly believed in reincarnation, to the idea that, well, whatever it is that might be reincarnated, it's not anything that you can, it's certainly not anything that you can find within yourself. And so it's, if you believe that the self that you feel you are is reincarnated, you're mistaken. And I met a lot of strong resistance to this. So I thought, okay, and of course everybody has, so-and-so talks about their past lives, and the Buddha refers, in one of the two versions of the Buddha's awakening, he refers to experiencing past lives and everything like that. So I need to figure out what this was all about. And so I did the practices. And at first, you know, I could see how easy it is if you're predisposed to think of this as a series of lives that were your life, like beads on a string. And somehow so the string was somehow this self that was being perpetuated from one lifetime to another, that entered into another body, that was reincarnated. And of course, if you look at the root of reincarnation, it means re-meatification. So re-entering into another piece of meat. But as I examined these past lives more and more closely, I realized this is more like watching, the hero in different movies. It wasn't me. There were things that I could identify strongly with in each of the let's call them other life experiences that I had. But there was absolutely no sense in which I could say, well, that was me that those things happened to, that was me, because it wasn't. It wasn't the self that that my mental constructs give rise to. It wasn't the historical autobiographical self. It wasn't the collection. It wasn't the collection of personality characteristics, except for some particular isolated few of those personality characteristics. Like I say, there was something about each of those past lives I could resonate with. So the conclusion that I came to is that because our minds are connected, that when you engage in practices like this, you will reach a point where you resonate in a particular way with somebody who has lived before, and that resonation will give you access to their memories and experiences. But that doesn't mean that in no way suggests that there's some sort of serial continuity, that there is some thread linking the beads together. You know, a bead being an entity that exists between birth and dissolution and death. And even further than that was that some of my strongest recollections had to do with with one particular individual in Nazi Germany during World War II, which is prior to, I was born at the end of World War II, 1945. But then I had, and so that opened me up to having some other past life experiences that occurred in the same era. And I realized that I was having recollections of lives that were being lived contemporaneously. And I thought about that, and I thought, well then, why would we regard this ability to tap into life experiences of people that lived before any different than the other closely related power of knowing the minds of others? And then finally, to add to that, is in my teaching experience, you know, I feel like I'm often channeling the knowledge and wisdom of Dharma and meditation teachers of the past. And I sometimes hear words coming out of my mouth that are new to me. And somebody asks me a question, and I listen to myself answering it, and I say, wow, I didn't know that. So all of this has given me a completely different perspective on this process. And for those of you with the inclination, I'm sorry that my memory is not good enough to give you direct pointers, but there is information out there about how to do these techniques. And I think what most commonly seems to happen is people, and you'll hear stories about this, people coming out of, for example, doing 6 months with PAOK or something like that, and having had past life, but it will be isolated to one or two. The kind of observations that I made were the result of making a large number of observations and following certain threads, like the thread that involved the particular, he was actually an officer in the German army, but following those threads that led to having, quote, recollections of different individuals who were alive at the same time. And then my personal experience of sometimes feeling like I was channeling information, and this actually happens quite often, that goes beyond what I am consciously aware of that I know personally. So, I mean, I can't rule out the possibility that some of this is wisdom that unconscious parts of my mind have figured out that that I haven't become conscious of before. But that's about as much as I feel like is worthwhile saying about that. It should give you all some food for thought about this whole issue of reincarnation. I am very confident in studying the suttas that on the one hand, the Buddha spoke to people in terms that they were familiar with, and at no point was he trying to make the point that you will be reincarnated, but rather was making some different point. And if he was talking to somebody who believed in reincarnation, he wasn't going to make them miss his point by engaging in some sort of dispute about whether this other belief was valid or not. Instead, he would just make use of their pre-existing belief to bring home the point that he was trying to make. So that's one thing about it. The other thing is, I think in so many cases, the reference to rebirth is the rebirth of the belief and attachment of personal self. That is what is genuinely reborn in every person. If you want to look at something that is a constant through a series of lives, but not through a single series of lives tied together by one thread, but through multiple series of lives, is the rebirth in the individual of the conviction that they are a separate self. And in the process of arriving at the place of being able to let go of that, as a stream entrant, to recognize that indeed there is no such thing as a separate self, and as an arhat, to recognize that, or to have the inherent sense of being a separate self just evaporate and disappear. That in the process of the practice of the Dharma, we go beyond the self, and then the self gets reborn. Well, if we look at any individual, any worldling, and we look at it in terms of the links of dependent origination, we see that as a description how on a fractal scale, from moment by moment to day by day to year by year, that this cycle of the links of dependent origination, I'm speaking specifically of link 3, which is consciousness, to link 10, which is becoming. You see that that is constantly being repeated, and with every repetition, the I is being reborn. This is the rebirth that the Buddha refers to. I have total conviction on that. And so I'll leave it at that. So we still have quite a few people here. So I'm going to succumb to the temptation to continue, at least for a few minutes longer. Give it another 5 or 10 minutes.
I don't have a question per se, but I just wanted to throw it out there for whoever asked the question about the formless jhanas, that leave, because I typed it in the chat, but I don't know that that'll show up on the video record when this gets posted to Patreon. So I just wanted to throw it out there. At least as far as the pleasure jhanas go, Lee Brasington's right concentration, in my experience, has a good enough instruction to get you in the formless pleasure jhanas. So that
Lee teaches that, that's for sure.
Yeah, I can't speak for luminous jhanas, but for pleasure jhanas, that was able to get me there. So I can help whoever asks the question.
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty sure that that you'll find that in either Tina Rasmussen's and Gary Snyder's, or Gary, what is his name? Steven Snyder, not Gary Snyder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
if not with him, with Shayla Catherine. Now, I do, as I recall, Shayla says, and I agree with this, as do many other teachers, that the form jhanas are the most important ones, not the formless jhanas. Although the formless jhanas can be illuminating as well. But yeah, thanks for the mention of Lee Brasington there. So let's go back to questions and maybe do one or two more. Thomas Bernardis, I don't know, is Thomas still with us? Yeah, there he is. Okay. So is Taylor. Good. Okay, so Thomas asks, in Deconstructing Yourself podcast interview, explain that mindfulness can be used in training of wholesome behavior and the practice of virtue. In this context, you made a point to mention that you could expand on the topic of how this applies to livelihood, but not then. Could you do that in this community? Yes. Maybe let's start by saying, what do all of the admonitions to virtue have in common with them, have in common with each other? And that is, they could be summed up by saying harmlessness, with the caveat that you have to recognize that there's a certain amount of pain and suffering in the world that is inevitable. So we can distinguish between that pain and suffering which is inevitable and pain and suffering which could be avoided, that is avoidable and unnecessary. So from that point of view, the practice of right speech, right action, and right livelihood, and you'll notice we rarely come across the positive aspect of right speech or right action or right livelihood being spoken of. It's mostly presented in the negative, that right speech is not doing this, right action is not doing this, and right livelihood is not doing this. But we can carry it a step further, that right speech is actually using speech in ways that are beneficial, that right action is performing actions that are beneficial, and that right livelihood is finding a way to live that produces the minimum harm and the maximum benefit to other beings. In other words, making a living and living in such a way that is positive, that your life is a positive contribution towards the reduction of unnecessary and avoidable suffering in general. Now let's look at right livelihood. Right livelihood is usually described on the negative side as not engaging in professions that bring harm to others, like selling intoxicants and weapons and being an assassin for hire and so on and so forth. You know, which would make you wonder about, certain modern livelihoods, like certain lawyers and things like that, certain ways of practicing law. But I see right livelihood as going far, far beyond how you earn your daily bread. It includes what kind of bread you buy and where you buy it, what kind of the clothing that you buy, how you transport yourself from one place to another. All of the actions that are a necessary part of you living in the world, you surviving, you being able to practice right livelihood in the sense of making a positive difference in the world as a whole. In other words, a positive difference in the sense of reducing the unnecessary and avoidable suffering in the world. So it's all of the other things that you do in order to stay alive and in order to manifest that kind of right livelihood. All of those things are right livelihood as well. So that's what I'm referring to. And so what this means is that this aspect of practice of virtue extends to all of the choices that we make throughout our days in different, when we're in the grocery store, when we're shopping for a vehicle, or when we're deciding to buy a vehicle rather than use public transportation, when we're buying our clothing. And one of the things to point out in this is that we're limited in our knowledge, in our wisdom, in our ability to predict the future and the overall consequences. So all we can do is come to the point that to the greatest ability of our greatest ability to predict the consequences of our actions, that we choose the least harmful and the most beneficial. This raises certain conundrums. Like, one example is you can buy a very inexpensive shirt made in Bangladesh in Walmart. Now, should you decline to buy that shirt, buy a more expensive one made in South Carolina, because buying that shirt contributes to the slave-like conditions that exist in unsafe clothing factories in Bangladesh, like the one that collapsed. So should you say, I'm not going to participate, I'm not going to support and contribute that kind of exploitation of human beings and the infliction of great suffering? Or you could say, I'm not going to buy a particular electronic device that was manufactured in China in the kind of conditions that we know exist in Chinese production facilities. But you could look at exactly the same thing and say, now if I don't buy this shirt, then there's going to be even more hunger in Bangladesh. If I don't buy this electronic product that's made by somebody who is living under terrible conditions in China and is being very underpaid, then there's going to be even less employment available for those people in China. Now, which way you personally decide to go, I can't tell you, and neither can anybody else tell you what's right or wrong in terms of that. You have to decide for yourself. And then you have to act according to what you believe is right livelihood, taking all of those different factors and whatever other factors that you might want to take into account, like how much synthetic fabric does a shirt contain as opposed to cotton, and what are the implications of converting petroleum to synthetic fabric versus the things that are a result of cotton agriculture. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you can weigh in this, and all you can do is the practice of virtue is to actually look at these things and make the best decision you can. Of course, a week later, you could decide that you should have made a different decision, and you would do something different at that time. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you can't predict the future. It only matters that you do your best in the moment when you make the decision as to what to do. And I'll give you another example of right livelihood that came up in one of my Thursday night sessions in Tucson. The two biggest employers in Tucson are the University of Arizona and Raytheon. Now, Raytheon makes, if you're not familiar, Raytheon makes all of the electronics for guided missiles and for all kinds of things. It is a war industry company, and I happen to mention choosing whether or not you work for a company like Raytheon as being an example of exercising right livelihood. And I'd stated it unintentionally in a way that made it sound like I was saying that anyone who worked for Raytheon was not practicing right livelihood. And there was somebody in the audience who was very sensitive about this, presumably because she or her husband or some members of her family or something worked for Raytheon, but there may have been other reasons as well. Anyway, she says there are some people that choose to work for companies like this, just as there are some people who choose to be in politics in order to see if they can't exert some kind of a positive influence. And I totally acknowledge that, and it gave me an opportunity to make clear that I wasn't intending, I apologize for sounding like that I was saying that working for Raytheon was wrong, was not right livelihood. But making the important point is that none of us have the degree of omniscience to say that anybody else's decision is wrong. But what we do is we make the best decision that we can, make the best choice that we can from the point of view of right livelihood, meaning that you avoid contributing to unnecessary pain and suffering in the world, and that as much as possible you do things that might reduce the amount of unnecessary pain and suffering in the world. And then, not being omniscient, you've just got to rely on your best judgment. So that's the things about right livelihood that I didn't want to get into in that podcast. And I'm quite happy to entertain anybody's responses to that right now in this group. Because there is a tendency to judge, right?
I mean,
How often have you found that?
Sorry?
And you should never judge, but what you should do, what would be positive and beneficial, is to gently and lovingly probe the individual and find out whether they had given some deep consideration to the decision they made, but not to judge the decision.
One thing that comes up for me, Culadasa, when you talk about that is that we don't really have the capacity to do that sort of reasoning about every decision that we make. There just isn't enough time in the day, and we have to do our practice and stuff. So
that's one of the limitations. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So part of the calculus is just like not freaking out about it.
Yeah, and it really illustrates an important point of the practice of virtue anyway. What makes it the practice of virtue is that you do the best that you can as the limited and fallible being that you are to live up to the fundamental principle of harmlessness in your speech, in your action, and in all of these various things that are part of right livelihood. And one of your limitations is often you don't have time to think about it. But if you thought about it later, you may decide that, well, that wasn't a wise decision. If that, having that thought later brings you the benefit of the practice of virtue. Because even though it was post facto, even though you can't undo what you did, then you've still evaluated your actions and your intentions from the point of view of virtue. Now, what's underlying all of this is, I used the example of buying a shirt at Walmart, but what was I going to say? Well, that particular thought thread got lost. Anyway, yeah, accepting, we have to accept our limitations, and we have to allow ourselves to be wrong, and we have to learn from it. Oh, yeah, I know what I was going to say. The decision to buy the shirt on Walmart, one of the factors that's going to affect a lot of us is, boy, this is cheap and I can save a lot of money. And where's that coming from? That's coming from selfishness and craving. Or maybe you have a closet full of shirts and you really don't need another one. You just think this one looks really cool. That's coming from a place of selfishness and craving. That's one of the things that we can do in making these decisions. We can't predict the consequences of our actions that well, but we sure can get in the habit of looking at our motivations. And so that makes it virtuous. And even if we look at, even if we do this post facto, it makes it virtuous. Now, as far as not being able to predict the consequences, there's a little story that I like to tell that illustrates that even when it seems obvious, our inability to predict the consequences can lead to exactly the opposite of the kind of result we thought it did. So this story takes place in Austria in the 1890s, and there's a man on the sidewalk who sees a runaway carriage careening down the street, and immediately in front of him, crossing the street, is a pregnant woman. So he leaps into the street, grabs her, pulls her out of the way of this oncoming carriage, and the infant that woman was carrying grew up to be Adolf Hitler. So by every possible measure of the event itself, it was a wholesome and positive act. And it reduced some avoidable pain and suffering in the world. But there was no way to predict. There was no way to predict what would happen subsequently. That's not our responsibility. In the practice of virtue, the only role of predicting the consequences is to try our best to evaluate whether this is something that will be consistent with the principle of ahimsa, or harmlessness, as I've defined it here. And the other most important thing is to look at your motivations, because every time you decline to act out of craving, you weaken the bonds of craving. Every time you decline to behave in a way that is self-gratifying or self-protecting, then you are weakening your attachment to the self. And so that's the real story behind the practice of virtue. And that's why right livelihood is a huge part of that. Okay, it's 3 o'clock. That's 2 hours. I think that probably this would be a good time to let you go. And I hope you enjoyed this and got some benefit and value from it. I enjoyed it enormously. I enjoyed talking to you, enjoy your questions, and I love seeing your faces. Being able to put a face with a name. There we go. Some of the faces I haven't been able to see are popping up. Well, thank you. So thank you all. Thank you for supporting us through Patreon. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for coming here today. And thank you for creating a couple of hours of what I hope is a positive and beneficial experience that will ultimately ramify throughout the entire universe.
Thank you.
Until next time.